Okay.
We will
give everyone a couple moments to come in before we start, and then Dean Babak will start with the introduction. Welcome everyone as you come in. We'll give you a couple minutes for people to come in and get settled. And then Dean Babak will start with the introductions, and then I will introduce our speaker. Okay. Welcome everyone. It looks like we've reached a steady state of participants. So I would like to start with an introduction by Dean Babak.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to everyone. This is the first for our academic year 21-22 seminar on education, engineering, and race. This was a series that was started actually a little more than over a year ago as part of McKelvey's overall response to an increased elevation of the conversations around race in general, following both national trends and the world of academia. One of the things that, as many of you know, we launched this last year a committee on diversity initiatives, and there's a bunch of goals that were listed on that committee, and they were showing me a slide, and the top one goal was basically encouraging, or really making it okay, to talk about race within McKelvey engineering. And I think in some deep sense, everything else follows from that. Or another way of saying it is, if you can't talk about race, then nothing is going to follow. And this seminar, this series, people engaging in this conversation is really all about that it's okay, and in fact encouraged, to talk about race within the McKelvey School of Engineering. And I want to thank all of you for participating and pushing that conversation forward. I'll take a quick minute to thank both Tammy Haney and Cindy Alvarez for helping make this, the logistics of this happen. And if there's been a silver lining out of COVID, we've learned that we can do a variety of things, both in person and virtually, in order to bring in larger populations. But what they don't tell you is that it then requires people behind the scenes to make all those logistics work. And Tammy and Cindy have really been pushing that forward. So I want to thank them both publicly. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn this over to our Vice Dean of Faculty Advancement, Jessica Wagensell.
All right, thank you, Dean Babak. So I will start with a land acknowledgement that Washington University in St. Louis is located on the traditional and ancestral territory of the Osage, Miami, and Sioux peoples. We thank them for their hospitality and stewardship of this land. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today. His name is Dr. Joel Alejandro Mejia. He's an associate professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Bicultural Bilingual Studies and the Department of Biomedical and Chemical Engineering at the University of Texas at San Antonio. His current work seeks to analyze and describe the assets, tensions, contradictions, and cultural collisions many Latino AX students experience in engineering through testimonials. He is particularly interested in approaches that contribute to a more expansive understanding of engineering in socio-cultural contexts, the impact of critical consciousness in engineering practice, and the development and implementation of culturally responsive pedagogies in engineering education. He holds a BS and an MS in metallurgical engineering from the University of Texas at El Paso and the University of Utah, respectively, and a PhD in engineering education from Utah State University. One additional note before I turn things over to Dr. Mejia is that we will have a separate Zoom meeting for 30-minute breakout sessions after the seminar from 4 to 4:30 Central Time. If you have pre-registered and already have a link to these sessions, then there's no need for further action. You'll simply leave this webinar and join that Zoom meeting at the end of the seminar. If you did not pre-register and want to participate, you can put that in the chat and Cindy or Tammy will give you the Zoom link, or they may have already put it in the chat for everyone. But you'll have access to that Zoom if you want to join the breakout sessions and did not pre-register. During Dr. Mejia's seminar, if you would put your questions in the Q&A of the webinar, I will be moderating those questions at the end of his presentation. So with that, I would like to turn things over to Dr. Alex Mejia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and obviously for the invitation. I'm going to start sharing my my slides with you. And okay. I want to make sure that you're seeing my full slides.
We're seeing your view, Alex. There we go.
There. All righty, perfect. That's what I wanted to make sure that I got right. Okay, so yes, today I'm going to be talking about the framework of Conocimiento in engineering education, and what does that mean for engineering education research? I know that we already went through a land acknowledgement, but I still want to acknowledge the Tonkawa and the Papayaya peoples of the Coahuiltecan band here in Texas. And I invite you all that as we gather here, both physically dispersed and virtually constructed, to take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place and in doing so recognizing the traditional lands on which we do business today and which we benefit from as well. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the social political context of engineering. And I see engineering as in the larger context, right? It has not been the exception when it comes to the idea of injustice. There is a social political context that has influenced how engineering has evolved over the years. And unfortunately, if we don't learn from those mistakes, right, we will continue to be unaware of the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, the historical context of the work that we do, but also how it impacts the populations that we do research with. I do research primarily with Latinos and primarily Mexican Americans. And in engineering education, and I think in other fields as well, we have been talking about Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes, Hispanics as a monolith group. And what I want to try to do with this presentation is to show dispel this myth of monolithic groups. So in talking about the social political context of engineering, I think that it is very important to consider it when we do research in engineering education. One, because engineering started as a fundamentally military endeavor, right? And as a military endeavor, it also comes from a place of settler colonial perspectives, right? And that has trickled down even to this point, and that can also create, the problems, right, as we try to diversify engineering, because we don't try to look at that social political context of engineering and where it comes from. So engineering initially started as a segregationist practice, right? Particularly in terms of the admissions criteria. Middle-class professional engineers deliberately crafted what the definition of engineering should be to exclude women as well as other lower class individuals and also men of color. And that was just to they just did that in order to just increase the professional status of engineering. One clear case that we have is the University of Maryland at College Park and the University of Maryland at Eastern Shore, right? The University of Maryland was so stressed, and this is not too long ago, right? This is during the civil rights movement. The University of Maryland was so stressed about desegregation that in doing so, they became the architects of Black education by shaping the future of the HBCU, which in this case was the University of Maryland at Eastern Shore, right? The University of Maryland system provided racially segregated education for Black and white people until its implementation of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. And the state concentrated engineering education in the primarily white College Park campus, while it focused on the Black Eastern Shore campus on agriculture and the trades. So even though both campuses were providing degrees in engineering, right? There was a segregation that was actually created, right? And in doing so, it produced a two-tier system for technical training with white people on the track to become professionals and Black people on the track to become technicians and tradesmen, right? Another example where we see this social political context of engineering is in the curricular priorities, right? There was a shift toward scientific coursework, and they moved away from practical classes after World War II. So that also created, again, this differentiation between what is considered engineering and what is not. So hierarchically, it positioned engineering as being, at the top, and technology as not having, enough value, right? So even in integrated school systems, like in Chicago in the 1960s, it actually served to segregate engineering and technical training through other means, right? So a lot of the times it was not necessarily through curriculum purposes, but also like through practices. For example, the city of Chicago commission articulated that young minority men would contribute to Chicago industry as competent repairmen and mechanics to service equipment, whereas young white men and a few high-achieving Black students would graduate into engineering positions, right? So there were all of these different policies in place to create this two-tier system, right? And eventually, obviously, the social political context of engineering. But there's also the enacting discourses, right? So American engineers, they build things, right? They build bridges, for example, but they have also constructed other cultural infrastructures, right? And they have engaged in narrative productions. So strategies of professionalization, the compilation of encyclopedias, the writing of autobiographies, the singing of songs, the telling of jokes, all of that forms part of, or it's part of the discourses, the dominant discourses of engineering, which place more value on certain ways of knowing and doing and being, and dismisses other ways of knowing, doing, and being. So with that said, right, that's the social political context of engineering. But there's also another social political context. And because my research focuses primarily on the US-Mexico borderland, right? The US-Mexico borderland is very, very long, right? It goes from one end of the coast to the other, pretty much. And I want to start by saying that I was born here in the United States, but like many other Latinos, I grew up in Mexico. I also call home the US-Mexico border, El Paso, Texas. And I understand that it's not the same everywhere, right? I got my education in engineering at the border, at the University of Texas at El Paso. And so I situate my work in this particular space and with this particular social cultural context, right? So on top of all of these different or all of this social political context that I talked about, that was more in terms of the policy, the actions, right? Then there's also that social political context of the space, right? So I recognize that how engineering's pragmatic nature influences engineering education, but I also think it's important to call attention to the history, right, and the social exclusion that comes from place itself, right? And I believe that engineering education has the ethical imperative to contend with this history and call attention to it and find ways to shift engineering so that we can provide greater access and representation to marginalized groups. And when we talk about the context of the border, right, the US South border, right, as we know it today, began with the occupation of northern Mexico by Anglo settlers, right? And that was even solidified after the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848. That annexation of northern Mexican territories resulted in the fulfillment of America's self-proclaimed manifest destiny, right? And it increased its landmass by 33%, creating a 2,000-mile border. So a large number of Latinos live in that area. And I mention this because when we talk about the world of engineering in the context of the southern border, right? And obviously you put on top of that the layer of engineering as a, as a militaristic practice, we end up with a social political context of engineering education at the border, right? What happened, right, after the Treaty of Guadalupe, and how did that influence engineering education in the southern border? Well, since then, there has been a lack of bilingual education, right? But it's also created and imposed tracking. I myself am one of those students who was tracked. I was one of those students who, just because I come from a low-income background, single parent home, migrant family, right? I was already placed as an at-risk student. What does that mean, right? I could not take any AP courses. Getting into the ESL program and then getting out of the ESL program, it's extremely difficult, right? And so the current state of education, right, impacts also engineering education, right? Mexican American students from the beginning, right, they were racialized, right? There was a racialization project of people of Mexican origin, right? And they were framed as people who were inferiors in all domains of life, including education. And these actions led to the dispossession, not just of the land, but also of the language and of their education. So in order to better analyze why the number of Latinos, Latinas, Latinxes in engineering continues to be stagnant, even after so many years of work in diversity and inclusion, it is necessary to understand the social political forces and how they impact the lives and the everyday experiences of this of other Latino, Latina, Latinx students. So other things, right, of this world of engineering or this social political context is that deficit thinking continues to exist. It frames Mexican American students as being culturally deprived, a lot of the times as culturally disadvantaged. And unfortunately, because we have not paid attention to this social political context, the methodologies used in engineering education research continue to be based on the behavior of the majority, and that is the white male population. So, and you can see this, right? This is not a problem of the past. The disposition of land was first, negating rights, not providing equal education, right? It's not a problem of the past. We have been having this conversation for the past 50 plus years, right? And you can see here in the percentages, only 9% of those that graduate, right, identify as Latino, Latina, Latinxes, and less than 1% are part of the faculty. So with this said, I propose the use of theories, methodologies, approaches that come from our community, for our community, done by people in our community, right? And Gloria Ansaldúa offers the Borderlands Theory, which is what I'm using to do my research. Borderlands scholarship, what it does, it makes the case for connecting the way in which these social political forces actually serve as the backdrop for people's lives, and it trickles down to influence the ways in which interactions and decision-making processes among both privileged and non-privileged occur, right? So in other words, context matters, and understanding Latino, Latina, Latinx identities and consciousness, their meaning-making processes, as well as their decision-making and opportunities, is important, right? So Borderlands Theory, what it does, it tries to illuminate the ways in which the political, the personal, the educational spheres all come together, right? And how they are linked to everything, who we are. And most importantly, Borderlands Theory is concerned with the way people negotiate those social forces and try to exert agency in response to the institutional bias, to the institutional injustices that are created, which in this case is what I'm going to be talking about for this talk. So, all right. So as we continue to work on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly when we talk about minoritized populations, again, we need to take into consideration the nuances that exist, right? Particularly the idea that Latinos are a monolith, because we're not, right? So Ansaldúa's Conocimiento framework offers that opportunity to dismantle that white narrative, right? The research in engineering education, if we want to advance participation of Latina, Latinos, Latinxes in the field, we need to explore and problematize the experiences, the strategies, right? Of students, using our own voices and our own approaches to our own culture and to our own upbringing, right? And that's what the Conocimiento framework tries to do. I also wanted to say how important, even for Gloria Ansaldúa, was to talk about this in the context of STEM, right? And here's a reflection on Ansaldúa's view of science, right? She says, the scientific story, which, sorry, I'm trying to, there you go. The scientific story, which has no way of measuring subjectivity, has created an industrial consumer society that's exploited the environment and puts us in this crisis situation where we're running out of resources. Many people live in the paradigm that progress means to produce and therefore consume more. As everyone knows, it's not working. Science has to change its story. It must accept information that goes beyond the five senses. So in this case, Ansaldúa talks about how science has prevented other voices to be heard because it is, a lot of the times we're thought of as not being objective, right? Or it's not objective. If everything is guided by production and consumption, whatever comes from other ways of knowing or doing is seen as being too out there, right? So what Ansaldúa is inviting us to do is to think differently about the ways of knowing, doing, and being that are being accepted in dominant spaces. But in order to use those ways of knowing, doing, and being, right, first we need to break that tradition of silence. We need to let individuals access the wealth of knowledge, which will enrich our knowledge production in engineering, but also provide alternatives for us to think about. So, oops. There you go. Sorry. So I want to walk you through the stages of conocimiento so that you understand this framework. The first stage of conocimiento is el arrebato, and it involves these unique experiences that make individuals question their own identity, right? These events can be described as fragmentations that a lot of the times are triggered by different life events. They can be mild, they can be strong, external, internal, life-changing. And they represent a fracture in one's belief system, values, feelings, forms of expression, etc. And I'm going to give you some examples of what these arrebatos mean in the context of my research. The second stage is Nepantla. The second stage says that individuals in both the physical and the symbolic border, like for example, for a lot of Latinos, engineering means this symbolic border, right? That a lot of times we are seen as transgressors, kind of, right? We're not seen as people that belong in that space. So we have to deal with those two different worlds in some sense, right? So Nepantla is this liminal space where individuals straddle between those two worlds. And it is not only where clashes occur, but also is the spaces where individuals try to make meaning of those conflicting realities, right? Some of those examples can be navigating two or more different cultures, two or more different languages, or even coming to terms with separate and contradictory identities. I've been part of SHEP for a long time, decided Hispanic professional engineers. And it is very contradictory sometimes when the message is, be proud of who you are, be proud of being Latino. But then when you're trying to go to the conference and get a job, right, the conversation turns into, you cannot be too Latino out there, right? You have to wear the khakis and the shirt. And if you're a woman, make sure that you don't have your hoop earrings and this and that, right? So it's this contradictory identities that we somehow have to embrace. The next stage is the Cuatlicue stage. And the Cuatlicue stage is a state where you are more aware, right? You start identifying all of these things in the world that surrounds you. So the next stage is El Compromiso. El Compromiso is when you start to get that rebirth, right? It provides you with a pathway to the possibility of reconstructing those fragmentations that you have experienced. El compromiso can be exemplified, for example, when communities of color are constantly being oppressed and hurt. And while people of color have tried to run away from it, right? The way they are perceived a lot of the times by majority groups, a lot of the times doesn't change. So what they have to do is to, they become aware of all of these different conflicting things going on in the world around them. Koyo Shauki is the next stage, and that's when you start to try to heal from trauma and the pain that takes place by both deconstruction and reconstruction. Then we go to the clash of realities. The clash of realities is when a lack of inclusion creates a multitude of realities that cannot be contained within, artificial embodiments, right? So as minoritized individuals begin to challenge the actions of the majority, unfortunately, the majority will continue to try to erase those experiences, right? And that is just the reality. That's what Ansel Dua says. And then the last stage is the transformation in spiritual activism. And that's where one learns to take those lessons that you're being dealt with inside and apply it to a larger community, right? So more like of that activist perspective, more of that finding your own truth, right? With but at the same time recognizing all of those boundaries and trying to do it collectively, right? So I know this is kind of complicated. I can definitely, I have a publication that's coming up, and I do a whole explanation of these different stages. So even though right here, I included it as kind of like a linear process, it's not a linear process. Gloria Ansaldúa talks about how arrebatos and choques and nepantla and all of these things can happen at any time in life, right? And you can always be thrown back into this space of Nepantla of dealing with two different realities. So more than a linear process, is more of a vortex, right? Where Nepantla, right, the fighting or this liminal space is always the most salient. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about how I'm using my this framework of conocimiento in engineering. The two main questions that I had here, and again, in an effort to do it in a more responsive way, right? I am, sorry, this is plugging in here. There you go. These questions come from my career grant. Okay, the first question that I have is how and in what ways do Latino, Latina, Latinx engineers negotiate and make meaning of their lived experiences as they navigate their engineering pathways? And also, how and what ways the stages of conocimiento are salient through these journeys, and what are the systemic factors that impact the entry, persistence, and departure from engineering pathways. So I don't want to focus so much on what the students are lacking or why they need to be fixed. I want to understand how the institution itself is creating this social political context that is just hard to navigate. Okay. So I have participants that are being recruited from 4-year institutions in the Borderlands, 2 public institutions. One is an HSI, one is an emerging HSI, one is a private institution, also an emerging HSI. There's a high number of transnationals, meaning they cross the border pretty much every day to go to school here in the United States. And they all self-identify as Latino, Latina, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, right? Any of the categories of Latin American descent. They're in the sophomore junior standing, and I'm following through not just their engineering pathway, but even after they graduate. So it's a longitudinal study, because I want to know, if 18% of Latinos are represented in engineering, but only 9% are represented in the workforce. What happens, right? Why is it that only almost half of them make it to the workforce? And obviously they need to be enrolled in engineering and an engineering program. I want to get through to the testimonials piece, right? But what I'm doing here is collecting testimonials. So these life experiences that are embedded, or it's a critical reflection that it's embedded within that social political reality that I was talking about. I'm also meeting with them where we engage in a lot of reflection. I also do community observations. I want to know how students even code switch from one environment to another, right? So that I can actually identify the dynamics that happen in this borderland settings, okay? And I'm asking them to create some journey mappings. Today, I'm gonna talk mostly about the testimonials. And I'm gonna show you examples of how the students are identifying their own social political context. They are aware of what's going on, right? But we haven't let those voices be heard, okay? So the first testimonial that I have here that exemplifies an arrebato comes from Alma, one of my participants, and she says, growing up, it was only Spanish, a little bit of English, only when I had to do homework. Sometimes my mom throws some otomi, which is something I grew up talking, but I do not talk it anymore because when I was in elementary, one teacher told my mom, she's not going to do well in school if you keep teaching her another language, which I find it funny because by the time you get to high school, you need to have that credit for another language. And I'm like, why do they do that to us? Why do they suppress us? Otomi is an indigenous language, and something that I found out through my research is that a large portion of the students that I have been talking to, they have very strong ties to those indigenous cultures and those indigenous communities. But the language is even more, a lot of them talk about how badly they feel, how bad they feel for the system itself, right? Creating this perception that because you speak an indigenous language, it's gonna hurt you more, right? Or an additional language. English has become the lingua franca for anything related to STEM, right? And so these unique experiences, a lot of the times make the students question their own identity. And these are types of arrebatos. El arrebato is like taking away from someone, right? And they're taking away from them their own language, right? Who they are. This example comes from Rodrigo, and he says, it has been eye-opening. I was really hurt when I came to college and I could not take my first class of math. I felt like I was set up for failure from the beginning. Sometimes I don't feel like I belong. It always comes down to when you take your first midterm, and that's when I start doubting. I see that in my sleeping schedule. Knowing that I do not have control over that just because of my education. I'm like, am I really cut out for this? Should I keep going? Am I going to be a fracaso, right? A failure? And again, a lot of the students also talked about the importance of having equitable access to the same opportunities a lot of students don't have once they come to college. And they're realizing that sometimes they feel cheated by their own public education, right? Because they don't have access to certified teachers because they're not allowed to take AP courses, right? So these clashes, these arrebatos are unique to each individual, but it's based on systems of coloniality and oppression that exist in the US and that have existed for a long time. And these arrebatos open individual's eyes about these fragmentations and also teaches them to deal with that rupturing in one way or another, right? And even adopting different identities, right? And as a result, individuals then are catapulted into this space of Nepantla, which is what I'm going to be talking about next. So the first example that I have here is also from Santiago. And he says, the first time I joined a research lab, a PhD student, he was very demeaning. He would tell me my data is crap. And I remember that time when he grabbed a pencil and told me, show me that you can do this calculation of like a molar concentration. Show me that you can actually do this because I don't think you can. And here I am, like my first time trying to do research and really trying my best. And he's like telling me like, you are not a researcher. You can't do this. If you show me you can do this, then you can proceed. So I'm scared of coming into the lab and thinking to myself, maybe I'm just dumb. Maybe I'm not cut out for this, right? So this also, again, the space that you create in your own lab is very important, right? Experiencing Nepantla, right? It's given this student in particular, la facultad, right? Or the ability to see beneath the surface. For example, living in Nepantla, it's allowing this student, right, for the materialization of hybridity, right? And that includes the mixing of cultures, of languages, of identities, right? But unfortunately, going into this space that it was completely foreign to him, which is the lab, right? Becomes now a very difficult space to just navigate in general, right? Another example comes from Roberto, where he says, the main shock for me is just the opportunity to do college. I have seen how when I go home, the opportunities are just not here. I'm not sure how I even got out of there. And my family is very supportive, but the families of my friends are also very supportive. So it makes me wonder, is the opportunity to do college just my privilege? Why couldn't my friends get that opportunity? It feels unreal, right? And so again, this navigation of spaces, right? Knowing that you can do college, but at the same time, looking at your own community and trying to find out answers about that. here's some examples of Coatlicue. And remember, Coatlicue is that state of meta-awareness where the individual sees themselves as both the subject and the object, and where they are both seen, but also are seen through the eyes, through the lens of others, right? And it can involve some type of disruption in who they are and who they want to be, right? And in this example, Santiago also says, there were very few Latinos in my school. If there were, I had no classes with them because I would take a lot of honors courses at school or AP classes. And there is this huge disparity in which the Latinos are in the non-honors and the non-AP courses. And then people who are in the AP courses are more white or Asian American. It was not until I came to college that I found a community of other Latinos who are also pursuing STEM, and it's been rewarding ever since. A lot of my participants also mentioned that, right? That the fact that they're perceived as being successful because they're able to be in the AP courses, but it's just them. It's not the rest of the community, right? It's not the rest of the students. For this student in particular, he was aware that there were other Latino students in school, but he never saw any of them in his classes, right? And so just because for the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next example of, in this case, el compromiso. El compromiso is when, there's that beginning of that rebirth, right? And it gives you the pathway to the possibility of restructuring all those fragmentations that you've been going through. And so in this example, Santiago says, eventually after 2 months, I quit the lab because it was just not good for me. And I did a lot of work on the project. I stayed up in the lab. I would stay up in the lab until 3 a.m. sometimes because I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to prove, no, I'm not dumb. I can do this. I'm going to do a good job. And you'll see that I can actually do this. I'm not what you think I am. Because of that first experience, I feel a lot of pressure because people might think that I'm the representation of all Latinos because there are not many of us. I will show that I'm not an insignificant worker, that I am the real deal. And it was so interesting, this particular case, because this student ended up going to MIT, right? He's using his talents to stop oppressors from preventing his own growth, right? Research for him became his way to face or confronting this discrimination and questioning that he constantly received in the lab, and used it to take a step forward to heal by discovering himself and his truth, right? In terms of Koyoshauki, this example comes from Adriana, and she says, my mom is always bringing me food, or my godmother, my uncle is always calling me, asking me, have you been doing this motivational breaths, or have you taken this nap? And it is getting to the point where my mom asks, are you sleeping? I know you have not been sleeping. And so she calls and she's like, I'm going to see you until you fall asleep, and then I will hang up. And it's like, that's a little too much for someone who's already in college, but I'm grateful for that. The support at first is like, I don't want them to know that how bad it's going, but if you don't let it out, but you need to let it out because you don't have anyone else to rely on, right? And so this Koyoshauki, remember that it's the process of healing, putting all of the pieces together, right? And a lot of the students have relied on support. Unfortunately, from my research, I found out that the support usually is very unusual to get the support from the institution. The support a lot of the times comes from the family, financial, right? A lot of parents making ends meet, trying to make ends meet, but also trying to save more money for their sons and daughters. It's a lot of that emotional support, community building, which is so important for them, right? Consejos, right? Consejos. So a lot of people trying to mentor them. The next example is in the terms of a clash of reality. So once individuals began to find themselves, even during the Reformation, right? It's when the majority of others will continue to challenge them and criticize even their healing, right? In this case, Elida, she says, moving out of my primarily Oaxacan neighborhood shifted the way I acted. And not in terms of socializing. I think it was trying to fit in more in what maybe teachers wanted, like trying to sound a little bit better, trying to get rid of my accent, all of those things. I think I recognized it with, I guess, the students. The teachers would applaud and the students that they wouldn't. And most of the time, it would be students that don't look like me and speak a certain way and have a certain background, because the school I attend it's in a very good neighborhood. And I think seeing the contrast between how the students are treated, it showed me what I was dealing with, right? So even after trying to abide by this particular discourses, the ways in which you have to behave, right? Students still acknowledge this clash of realities, right? This social political context, and we cannot ignore it. The last example that I want to provide here is the transformation, right? Which is where one learns to take the lessons that one is being dealt with and tries to apply it to a larger community. It is kind of the pinnacle of acceptance, right? Of trying to find your own truth and trying to seek connections where others see boundaries, right? And in this case, Santiago, he says, seeing a successful Latino professor at a top tier institution was good. He was talking about a summer experience. He had time for his students. The lab I work in is very disorganized and people are not invested in mentoring, but my summer experience was different. The professor paid more attention to me. He was more invested in student. He would take us to dinner, and at dinner, he was celebrating one student that had recently accepted a position at one who defended his dissertation. I want to do that. I am interested in helping support students' trajectory to academy, but I know I will not find that everywhere, and I have to be selective, right? So I think that it gets to the point where the students learn what they're dealing with, and then they have to make those decisions, right? So what does this analysis of testimonials say? Well, one is that students a lot of the time see themselves as atravesadas, right? They're sometimes seen as transgressors. They're often seen as those who are the prohibited or the invalid inhabitants of this borderland, right? If we want to call it in that type of metaphor of engineering plus education, right? And they're seen as transgressors because they pass over, or go through the confines of what it's supposed to be the normal. And this is the lived reality of many Latinx students, right? And they understand that social political reality, right? And they're seen as transgressors rather than inhabitants of those spaces, because they only see, because only the only legitimate inhabitants are those who are in power, or those who end up aligning with those who are in power. It also shows us that arrebatos are very diverse. It includes being tokenized, being questioned about credentials, being harassed, being bullied, and that these can occur at any point in time. And they range from the cultural erasure to the language delegitimization to even poor treatment from others in engineering spaces. Students are also nepantleando, right? Meaning that they're always dealing with these different spaces. And nepantle itself is contextual, it's situational, and it is not representative of a monolith. There's also a process of fragmentation and defragmentation, right? There's a recognition of the social political context. And it is that recognition of that social political context that it's kind of the first step to rewriting their own narratives. And there's also a process of desconocimiento, right? Students at this stage are struggling a lot with choques and with arrebatos, right? A lot of them talk about different forms of shame, of fear, of guilt, of hopelessness, right? But there's also the recognition of issues that need to be questioned and addressed, right? So there's still that dynamic of trying to reach conocimiento and still trying to struggle with this. And think about it, right? It is very different to get defragmented in 10,000 pieces and trying to put yourself together back into place, right? Let's say you have a cup, your favorite cup, it falls onto the ground, it breaks into 5,000 pieces. If you try to put that favorite, cup together, right? Put all the pieces together, it's going to take you forever. It's a long and arduous process. But if it falls and it's only the handle that breaks off, it's not such of that emotional stress that you have to go through. And what a lot of these students are going through, it's a lot of emotional stress imposed by the institution. So moving forward, I don't like to use the word conclusion because I think this is still a conversation that needs to continue, right? Engineering is not a purely cognitive process. It occurs in different contexts, and it is highly influenced by social, by cultural, by linguistic practices of individuals. And students have an opportunity to conceptualize engineering in their own terms and situate their own engineering discourse, but we're not necessarily providing this conversational spaces to do that. So as I guess a concluding remark here, I want to talk about the importance of doing research in our own terms, from our own perspectives, with our own communities, right? And doing it in a way that is respectful to our own communities, that actually validates and authenticates those individuals and their lived realities, right? It is a way to also challenge colonialism, and it's a way to challenge the dominant discourses, right? And so it should be, I think that the Conocimiento framework is great, but it also should be used with caution and respect, right? And that is my call to action to all engineering education researchers out there. So with that, I obviously want to thank the National Science Foundation for funding this research. And if you want to contact me, I'm also on Twitter. Feel free to contact me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Clap. I don't think anyone else can hear. Thank you very much, Dr. Mejia. So we do have a couple questions in the chat, and then I encourage the audience to continue placing questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So the first question in the chat is from Lori Sutton, the chair of biomedical engineering, who says, as an academic leader, what actions can we take to demonstrate that the community welcomes expression of the Latino identity, including dress and cultural references?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, that's a really good and important question that everybody should be asking, right? How can we do this? And I think that the first step is to acknowledge that right now, it's not happening, right? I think that acknowledging that we lack that space and providing the space for students to express themselves the way they want to is the first step. And then if you want a more actionable, thing, I think that don't try to do everything at once, because then it's going to be a mess. Try to do it incrementally, right? And it could be as easy as probably providing more faces, like our faces in the curriculum, right? It shouldn't be that hard. Like, we have contributed to engineering in many, many ways, but the curriculum still continues to follow, a very linear, way of thinking. There are other ways of thinking. There are other Latino engineers out there, community, like, acknowledge us as holders and creators of knowledge, right? That we're not here just so that you can dump all of your knowledge on us. We also have something to contribute to the conversation. But I think that creating the space, first of all, is important, and acknowledging that that the problem exists is also very, very important.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Neil Patwari, who's a faculty member in the school. He says that Dean Bobbick introduced the seminar series as a way to make it okay to talk about race in the McKelvey School of Engineering. In your research, what happens when students of color talk about race? How does that compare to when white students talk about race?
Yeah, so I think it really depends, though. And I'll make this disclaimer. So the fact that I am Latino and that I can talk to them in Spanish, right? Like positionality really matters when you're doing research with Latino students, right? Who you are, how you identify, how you connect with the students, and how you start building that trust with the students is very, very different when you're able to connect with students. Now, how do they talk about race compared to white students? I think that just because of the way in which I have built this trust with my students, and I have tried to create, create those bridges with the students, I think that they feel more comfortable, at least with me, talking about issues of race, because I have also experienced it and I have shared it with them. And I think that that is an important thing to do, like share with your students, how you have experienced these things or how you're opening the spaces so that they can also feel more comfortable to talk about these issues and not feel like they're being attacked. I think also it's important to say that singling out students is not a good thing, right? They're going to shut down. Particularly if you have only one Latino or one Black or African American or Native American student in your class, and you're always turning to that person to provide or to speak for everybody, it's also not a good way to, to have those conversations. I think that the conversation should be in I statements, how I experience it, what I feel about it. And I think that's going to provide a more constructive dialogue in the end. And don't be afraid to bring in experts from other fields, right? As engineers, we don't know everything. Invite others, invite sociologists, anthropologists, people in ethnic studies, and I'm sure you have great people at your institution that can help you or give you some feedback on how you can start having these conversations in your own classrooms.
Yeah. So I noted you made one of the testimonials talked about preparation, how they didn't feel prepared. I think it was for the math class.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also commented on support and how that was often not coming from the institution. So do you have any thoughts on, how the institution can address both support and preparedness, right? So how can we help when maybe those structures are not present?
Mm-hmm. I think that an important way to do it is think more broadly about what culturally responsive education would look like in your institution, right? Be attuned to the highlighting those voices that are not part of your of the conversation at your institution. And I invite you all to think about, like I said, culturally responsive education. Students need to see themselves reflected in the curriculum to feel like they belong, right? And a lot of research has talked about that. So think about how you can make sure that your curriculum helps do that. How do I get my students to see themselves reflected in the curriculum? Maybe you can start by changing one of those case studies, right? To be about the Hyatt Regency, because I think that a lot of us use that example, right? Or have used that example. Maybe you can use a different example, right? Maybe you can use the example of the highway system and how it actually created a segregated communities and how it was, how it perpetuated that. Or you can also talk about great architects and civil engineers that come from Latin America that have done great work. So try to think of culturally responsive education. How can you involve community? And one of the components of culturally responsive education is, how do I get my students to think about the engineering work that we do in social technical terms, right? That it's not just the technical piece, but the social piece is also very important, and helping them develop that critical consciousness. I think, you know, that's one way that you can bring in more students and provide those spaces for students to have these conversations.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, we are right at 4 o'clock. So I'd like to thank Dr. Mejia for his presentation today and thank all of our participants. And again, please join us in the breakout sessions. You can click on the link right now that's in the chat. And I will be there. I think
I'll be
Dr.
there.
Mejia might be there. Yes.
Yeah.
And then we have some student moderators who are probably already there waiting for us. So thank you very
All
much.
right. Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation.
Bye.
Bye.